He didn't hold with your father's ideals, thought he should have stayed here and not gotten involved.
You fought in the Clone Wars?
Yes. I was once a Jedi Knight, the same as your father.
Last electric night.
You're the baddest little dude I've ever seen.
Hello, my name is Michael Eisner, and welcome to Double Feature Night on the Disney Sunday Movie. In our first one-hour movie, The Last Electric Night, he teams up with a tough, hard-nosed street cop and finds plenty of opportunities to use his awesome karate skills. So let's watch what happens when the modern world runs smack into the mystique and tradition of the Agent of...
Which reminds me, I have something here for you. Your father wanted you to have this when you were old enough, but your uncle wouldn't allow it. He feared you might follow old Obi-Wan on some damn fool idealistic crusade like your father did. Now the Jedi are all but extinct. Vader was seduced by the dark side of the Force.
The focus today will be these electrical weapons.
The Force?
Now, the Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us, penetrates us, it binds the galaxy together.
Possibly electrical weapons in what we think of as the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, all the way up until the 1700s sometime, maybe a little bit into the 1800s, before the vast amounts of turmoil happened.
Father's lightsaber. This is the weapon of a Jedi Knight.
But I want you to soak it in, get a good look at this picture. This may tie into the video I'm going to do about electrical architecture, also known as technasmia, and how the illumination happened that is characterized now as having not existed, and that they just burnt torches going into any area. Never mind the fact that torches don't last that long, and oil lamps, perhaps in more ancient times, certainly in biblical references, there are many to the oil lamps that used fuel. But sometime after that, they got into some electrical illumination, and that technology is, well, possibly demonstrated today in a few rare instances, which I will show you. And you may have seen one of them before, but there's a new one that is quite interesting. Now, it may tie into this photo because what you're looking at here, it's representative of several very prescient things that I've been talking about. Bricks, but giants, possibly electrical architecture. And the topic of today, electrical weaponry, the Electric Knights. So we'll have a look at that again. We'll revisit it, okay? So what are we looking at here? Well, the swords, the armor mainly. And we have some fascinating diagrams. Now, many of these drawings that have this stylized print, you have to realize that almost every time we're looking at old photographs and old manuals, codexes, all these books, they're things that they're made available from museums, and many of them have been heavily censored. You know those stamps on library books? Sometimes there are red stamps on these things, and you have to start to scrutinize even those as the marks of censors. Now, I picked up on the fact that they whited out and photoshopped a lot of things. That's where I came up with the Niller skies. I first saw it in my own real life time with the Niller skies of a certain day in September, a certain year in the past, when even the horizon, even New Jersey, was wiped out, and it was just blank white blending in with the sky, in the same shot, the same angle, the same distance of this group of buildings that were or were not there. Clearly shows there was heavy manipulation going on. I talked about the scepters and how they kind of look like magic wands as we know it from fiction, or is it nonfiction? Because I contended, and also Martin of Flat Earth British, he says the same things, that he thinks these are weapons, that they had some purpose other than decorative or symbolic or whatever nonsense they tell us nowadays. And it would make sense. If you're the king, yes, you have guards, and the guards weren't carrying these. The king carried this. But if there were a weapon that was extremely powerful, that was superior to what the guards had, would the king give it to the guards, or would the king himself have it? Now, maybe this weapon or how to use it, that has been lost, but they still give this to the king, and it has become symbolic. But what was it? Was it always symbolic? I mean, why this stick like this? I mean, I guess he could whack it against somebody. It seems a little juvenile, though. It'd be more intelligent if there were actually a purpose for that. The same is true for these. And I want to mention the channel Global Vision, where a lot of this material comes from, although the idea has been out there and I've been working on it, but he did such a fantastic job putting things together. I need to mention that. And he provided some helpful links to some material that's made available that I used for this video. So I want to thank him for that and direct you to his channel, which is listed in the prescription below. So here, in these swords, you have a couple of elements that you see over and over again. And so you have the knobby ends, just like you do on the cannons. And then you have some perforations. You have some welding of metal conductors, really like wires. But there are also these hand grip cords wrapped around the handle of the sword. And that usually is metallic. Even if it's fabric, it has a metallic weave in it. So it is a coil, so it is somewhat electrical or electromagnetic in nature. At least it would respond to electromagnetic frequencies the way any coil would, as far as receiving, producing these fields, electrical fields. And there is an interesting gap between these metal extensions that provide an anode and cathode, much like a welder's tip, or like a spark plug, or any number of examples. Yes, obviously, the conventional wisdom, it is true that if you're in a sword fight, hand-to-hand combat, that protective disc or ring or whatever shape it takes is there for obvious reasons to protect your hand. But the decoration, the ornamentation, sometimes we assume that it is merely decorative or merely ornamental, but perhaps there is a function, like with these holes on either side of the shaft of the blade. That could be for any number of things, including a protrusion of wire. Same thing with the knobs on the ends. It's a nice place to wrap some conductive wire around if they did that. And the point that we are making is that perhaps they were like a lightsaber. And I will show you some pictures that would support that, or rather not pictures, but drawings of demonstrations. The expos of their day show lightning coming from these swords. And look at the copper. It looks like copper. It could be brass, the inlay. Very interesting that they would do it that way. And I see the golden ratio in the geometric shapes on many of these weapons. The materials of brass and the iron, the nickel, it's all conductive. And oftentimes there are holes for some kind of a wire to go through, and always the grip is wrapped with a metallic fiber weave. Now look at this suit of armor. There are a number of things to mention about it, but this sword, my goodness. Yes, it's supposedly it's a two-handed sword that is a sword specifically for battling against mounted riders. That's what we're told. But there are a lot of things about different swords that suggest maybe there's more to the story. And the serrations, these shapes, these extensions, the knobs, some of the elements are nice, decorative, yes, ornamental, yes, but maybe there's more to it. There are more functional, practical reasons for it. And especially the size. I mean, look at that size. I mean, folks, the handle grips look like they're made for two hands, but what size of hands? Really big hands. I mean, there's plenty of room for two hands. I understand the leverage aspect of it and having the knob at the end so your hand doesn't slip off the end, but stick with me. Now, the thing I noticed about this is it's not sharp. And I've seen this a lot. I've been disappointed. I was into swords and suits of armor when I was a kid. So it's quite a long time ago. I mean, I don't remember everything I learned at that time. It's probably a lot of bollocks anyway, but I do remember being disappointed when I would look at what was supposedly a real set of armor or a real sword. When I got over to Europe the first time and got to one of these older castles and looked at it, I was sorely disappointed. Now, I was very much impressed by the building. I was impressed by the size of the swords and that type of stuff. The suits of armor weren't very impressive. They seemed chintzy and thin and light to me, although I didn't get to handle them much at all, or if at all. The swords were kind of heavy and they were dull, very dull. But I've seen in other videos, and I don't necessarily want to show it because of copyright, but where they tested these suits of armor, and the conventional wisdom is, yeah, it protects you much better against all kinds of weapons, especially like arrows. But the fact of the matter is, a longbowman, when he shot at a recreation of a suit of armor, from almost any distance, he totally penetrated any part of the armor with any of his arrow heads. And yes, I mean, at point blank, sure, he has an advantage, but still, I thought, that would deflect off. But the thing is, I'm thinking of steel. These things weren't made of steel. They didn't have steel, apparently. It's a softer metal, and it penetrates. So if you start taking a look at electrical fields, and you can do these overlay ultraviolet images, or it could be infrared, but polarized. You can see these electrical fields coming off in nodes and different array patterns based on the geometry of the metal. And so you can see what we're talking about here with these plasma discharges and different ideas that we have for that. And it even may be evident in some of the heretofore thought of as decorative wear. So the various shapes that we get, obviously it could be just to save material and weight for better handling. But what if it was more than that? If you look at the grip, it's always metal around the grip, always room for wires. The knob on the end, maybe it's a wear point. Maybe it is. But the sword itself, a lot of these swords, they don't seem very practical. Like, you could poke somebody with this, sure. But it's not really a slashing sword. Like fencing, those swords are kind of lame compared to other ones. And then you get things like this that just seem very strange. Very, very strange. Like, what's going on? But imagine that electrified, all the little electrical fields coming off, the little arcs. So maybe we've never seen these things in action. These little numbers seem very odd. What would you do with that? It's kind of silly in a way. It's spring-loaded. That's kind of cool for that old technology. But if you think of those mad scientists, like in the Frankenstein movies, the old ones with the electrical arcing going up and then stopping and then going up, and maybe that's what was going on. Except that would be bipole. You've got 3 here, but you could have 2 arcs going up. It'd be like a taser gun in that sense. And then this shield, the little pokey doohickey unicorn horns coming out the ends of those look as strange as that funky antenna on the lunar lander. But really they look more like some of the old TV antennas and things like that. Is that what it was? Was this like the communication officer's gear? We don't know. I like the little peephole there, like you could just put your little pistol through it. That'd actually be pretty practical nowadays for like riot gear or anti-rioter gear, anti-riot police gear, whatever. Here you can see how the electrical fields in an arcing overcharge situation would come out. This would be like the excuse that PG&E was making for why the fires start in California. Of course, I don't believe that PG&E is the only entity at fault there. There's a lot going on. This was just a weird thing, this strange creature that is depicted here, but it's from the text of the book of Revelation about the end times, and this monster, the Tiber monster, said to have washed up on the banks of the Tiber River in Rome after a flood in 1496. Has a couple sources. And in the Book of Miracles, Das Wunderbuch, I think is what it's called in German, it ends with about 20 pages taken from the Book of Revelation, including this. So Revelation 13 verses 1 through 4, I think, describe this creature. So if it washed up in 1496, are we after the end times? It's an interesting thought. We're going to revisit that in the future. It's kind of freaky. I am hesitant and loath to even broach the subject, but the evidence is mounting. It's got me a little bit shaken up, honestly. Well, I'm always honest with you, openly. I don't want to be infected by that silly speech. I'm always honest with you. To be open, to share with you something that I would normally hesitate to share due to a natural trepidation when it comes to subjects that are unsettling. Or perhaps reassuring, I don't know. But from where I see it now, it's a bit unsettling. So in the electrical architecture video, you're going to see more of this. I don't know why it's in there now, but we're looking at these antennas. So, so if you look at this little animation, you have these scalar waves, okay, that happen
A lot
with
of it.
alternating current in an electrical field, okay, and you know, with what's going on in California, since we're talking about weapons.
A lot of us have heard of Santa Ana winds before in Southern California that bring about some of the most destructive fires. For us, the Diablo winds are just as fierce, and they actually start several hundred miles away from us in the Bay Area. What actually happens, and what happened last night, there's an area of low pressure centered right around San Diego, and around an area of low pressure, the winds are counterclockwise. And when those winds arrive here in the Bay Area, they're coming out of the north and coming out of the east. And that wind direction is actually coming from Mount Diablo.
Its smaller neighbors, Concal and Magalia, were all but destroyed.
Thus the name, the Diablo winds. And when those winds descend down our hills, like they did last night, what they actually do coming down those hills, they speed up to wind gusts in excess of 50, 60 miles per hour.
How would you describe this fire?
Apocalyptic.
They actually warm up the air, and that dries the air. So last night in the North Bay, you probably felt the warm breeze, the low humidity. Unfortunately, Dan and Amma, these winds in October caused some of our most destructive fires all year round.
Oh, really? Coming up from San Diego now, the Diablo winds, but it's bypassing the Santa Ana winds?
Using this new tool, Ken Pimlott, chief of the California Department of Forest projections on this 3D map, chart the course of the fire.
You see how they confuse us, folks? And then they have to come up with more terms to explain why 3,000-pound cars are flipped on their roofs and temperatures get so hot, and they come up with the term fire NATO.
You have these insane forecasts. You have these insane winds that heretofore didn't exist until the new normal. Now, they've been pushing climate change, but I think there's way more to it than that, and it's not your fault, and it's not my fault. How could they have been all ready to go with these terms of things that never happened before, and they're trying to sell it and play it off like it's natural, but it couldn't possibly be natural? Well, they would say, well, it's man-made climate change happening. Well, I reject that for so many reasons, but nevertheless, it seems very convenient that they can predict fire weather and that these winds come along and they kind of already know that they're going to happen. How can you know wind is going to happen exactly like that? You know, it's very unsettling. And then they have this power outage. PG&E shuts off the power, and then after the power is shut off, then the fire starts. It's like, okay, power lines never caused fires for 50, 70, 80, since 1850, since we started keeping records, since 1850s when everything pretty much began. And now, all of a sudden, and I remember they were saying, well, it's because of the 110-degree weather and this and that, but it's not. It's not 110 degrees, and they still have these things. They still predict it anyway, and then it still happens, and then they shut off all the power, and then the fires still happen. And you got the fire NATO. Again, with the terminology, something that never really existed naturally, no way.
Where did the fire start?
Fire started in the community of Polga at about 6:30 in the morning on November 8th, and it was quickly accelerated by 40-mile-an-hour winds coming from the north.
Look at this.
The fire was growing at this time at a rate of 1.
This is all the tan color here, and then the high wind watch that you can see in some of the higher elevations, covering a good section up there in the North Bay, but Solano County particularly here. And we expect some of these wind gusts to get beyond 40 and 50 miles per hour. Now, a high wind warning, we should mention, what that means is that means winds are high enough that they can cause in and of themselves property damage.
And where does the wind even come from? They show wind coming out of some area where the wind is coming out of that area going somewhere else too. And they've got it all figured out.
About 95% of Paradise was lost.
The fire was growing at this time at a rate of 1 football field a second, so an acre a second.
Football field a second.
Yes.
It's nonsense. Nonsense.
What is it, Aunt Julia?
The cackling ghost is out there.
Now, dear.
I'm not going batty. Look out there.
Not a thing, Aunt Julia. There's nothing out there. You're imagining things again, darling.
Don't darling me. I did not imagine it.
Aunt Julia, perhaps there is something to the Darjeeling necklace. The old curse, I mean.
Fiddlesticks. I don't believe in curses. That's for ignorant, superstitious poor souls. And I don't believe in ghosts either.
Ever there's trouble, we're there on the double. We're the Bloodhound Gang. If you got the crime, we've got the time. We're the Bloodhound Gang.
According to the curse, anyone possessing it would go mad. Mrs. Fairbanks, who owned the necklace, began to wonder about her sanity. She heard strange voices and laughter on her radio, and she saw a ghost.
Well, this is the most severe fire I've ever seen. This here is a prime example of...
It has a long and sinister history.
One of the big dangers on why we're concerned on letting citizens back into the community paradise.
Sinister? There's said to be a curse attached to it, all perfectly idiotic.
Because this is exactly what we're scared of.
One of those you'll have bad luck sort of curses?
What happens is the deep roots into this thing leave holes like we can see over here, and the fire burned down in there.
If one believes that sort of nonsense.
So it just sits down in there and smolders and slowly eats away at the inside of this trunk. And eventually, this tree would have fallen down, and if somebody or a firefighter or a citizen had been in its way, it would have crushed them.
One believes that sort of nonsense.
Has it happened?
The Grand Mogul's wife, and a few others. Mere coincidence, of course. But lately, I've begun to hear sounds and see things.
The raging climate-fueled wildfires.
I think it's much different than that. We are in the problem and we are the solution. So it's not going to be easy, but we'll get it done. And we have the most expensive lawyers in the world that will argue it out in exquisite detail. So I'm not gonna answer. So it's not one thing. It's people. It's how people live. It's where they live.
Out there on the grounds, that ridiculous cackling.
Moisture, all the rest of the things we've talked about. And the truth is, and I don't want to be giving any happy time news, we're going to have more difficulties. Things are not going to get better.
She believed neither in curses nor in ghosts and called in the Bloodhound Gang to investigate. Vicky noticed that Mrs. Fairbanks' nephew, Edmund, merely pretended to lock the valuable jewels in the safe.
Doc, we're looking for clues, not wildlife.
Mrs. Fairbanks' gardener and chauffeur, Townsend, explained that a chemical smell...
Do let me sell it for you.
Edmund kept urging his aunt to let him sell the necklace for her at a fraction of its value. She refused. And now for the conclusion of the case of the cackling...
That's more like what actually is happening than just target. I do think the pine needles on the ground burn, but what does it have to do with everything? Well, look at the scalar waves. The picture that I put in here from the California fires, you have scalar waves right there before your very eyes that tells you there's a heavily charged electromagnetic field or beam or energy hitting that area pretty hard at that moment. So that's the type of technology that we're talking about here. And you have some cases of old photos of battles and warfare where they have some interesting shots and interesting comments, like the one about the airship attack and the attack by the electrical fasces. That's just one thing that made it past the censorship, and it was in Gallica with regards to Paris, and old drawing there. So kind of a quick one, but it's a lot of new information for a lot of people, a lot of stuff to chew on. But let's revisit this picture. Remember this? Okay, now this is going to blow your mind. So you thought you had it figured out. That's one of these swords. Yeah, it's a big sword. It's hanging on the side of the building. What is it doing there? Well, maybe it was all lit up with electrical arcing energy and illuminated like a signpost, and it was a lit sign, quite possibly. But I want you to see this. Check it out. Look at the size of it. That is a shield. There are some plates or pieces of, parts of plate armor, perhaps, like where your shoulder goes, or for the joints, the elbow. And you have one of those two-handed swords, but my goodness, is it huge or what? Even the bricks are huge. Remember I told you how you go down lower into the ground, you find bigger bricks. Now it makes sense you'd have bigger bricks for foundation stones, but no, it's not always foundation. It's oftentimes you have windows and things like that, because it used to be above ground. It's that people were bigger. I mean, come on. They were bigger and smarter, perhaps, or at least as smart, probably a lot smarter. So that's not meant to make you feel bad. It's just, they had some high tech. That's all I'm saying. We're smart enough to figure that out, right? The evidence is there. All you have to do is look and see it. So you have this photo of this knight with, what is he holding? Here you have like a Mudflood thing going on there. Over here, What is that? Well, we'll talk about that next time. There's a lot of electrical stuff going on. But the focus of this video is just the weaponry. So I hope you enjoyed it. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Oh, there's some more stuff. There's a lot of curious elements when it comes to these weapons. I think we have been told some fibs. There are some things that just don't make sense about them, that make them very impractical. And it's easy to say, oh, well, it's decorative. And they do that nowadays with the decorative weapons and novelty type things. But do we think they really wasted their time with that kind of stuff back then? I mean, look, there's a screw in there. That's to clamp down. It's just like wiring an outlet, I believe. And yeah. So do I know exactly how they work? No, but I'm sure the more we look, the more we will find. The more we find, the more we know. Oh yeah, I want you to see this Mudflood picture. Sometimes I just come across something that it's really has to do with one of my past videos, but it just really supports the conjecture that we issued forth based on the smaller amount of evidence that we had in the past. And so when something comes along that validates or invalidates what we were saying, I think it's important to show, and this is it. There is definitely a Mudflood, no doubt about it. And you can see how they do what we think they did. They just built right on top of it. And it looks like there's some excavation happening, but it's limited. Now maybe they built their houses like that, but who builds houses like that? I mean, come on. You have bugs everywhere. There's ye olde ladderline. But this was interesting because it shows how they photoshopped in the smoke out of that chimney for some reason. Because there are other photos, the identical photo, and there's no smoke. So why would they do that? Maybe it's a different photo, but boy, does it look close. So, and then the silliness of these cannons and just the size, and then everything's wiped out, just dead. The structures are so old and abandoned, and where are the trees? Heck, is there even grass there? It's crazy. So, electric night. Hope you enjoyed. Have a good one. Bye-bye.